The war that many thought would end in months had now swallowed the nation. By 1862, hope was fading, armies were bleeding, and a new kind of brutality was unfolding. But in the chaos, a quiet, determined general began to rise, changing the fate of the Union forever. This is episode 2 of the American Civil War. The war had begun with hope, with celebration, with the belief that it would end quickly. But by 1862, both sides understood the truth. This would be a long war, a brutal war, a war that would consume everything. In the West, a quiet general was beginning to change the war. The Union finally found a new hope in a quiet general. Ulysses S. Grant was not impressive at first glance. He had resigned from the army in 1854 under a cloud of alcoholism, had failed at farming, at business, at everything he tried. When the war began, he was 39 years old, working as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. But he was a West Point graduate. He had combat experience from Mexico, and he wanted to serve. He received command of an Illinois volunteer regiment, then a district in Missouri, then a small army in southern Illinois. In February 1862, Grant launched his first major offensive. Fort Henry on the Tennessee River fell quickly to Union gunboats. Then Grant marched overland to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. The Confederate commander, believing Grant would wait for his gunboats to arrive, attempted a breakout. The attack initially succeeded. The Confederate forces opened an escape route. But Grant, arriving on the battlefield, assessed the situation immediately. "The enemy has tried to force his way out, but has not succeeded," he said. "We will now force our way in." He counterattacked. The Confederates retreated back into their fort, demoralized. When the Confederate commander asked for terms, Grant's response became famous. "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." From that day forward, he was known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. 15,000 Confederate soldiers surrendered, the first major Union victory of the war. Grant's victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson opened Tennessee to Union invasion, secured Kentucky, and gave the North control of 2 major rivers. More importantly, they signaled a turning point. The North finally had a general willing to fight, who understood that the war would be won by aggressive action, not cautious maneuvering. And the South had a new enemy to fear. Lincoln, thrilled by Grant's success, promoted him to Major General. "I can't spare this man," Lincoln said when critics complained about Grant's drinking. "He fights." Grant would get his next test soon, at a place called Shiloh. Shiloh shattered the illusion of quick victory. Grant's army was encamped near Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee in early April 1862, waiting for reinforcements before advancing deeper into Confederate territory. They were not entrenched, not expecting an attack. Grant believed the Confederates would not take the offensive. He was wrong. On April 6th, Confederate forces under Albert Sidney Johnston launched a massive surprise attack. Union soldiers were caught having breakfast, cooking in their camps, cleaning weapons, writing letters home. Then the rebel yell erupted from the woods, thousands of Confederates charging. The Union lines collapsed, entire regiments broke and fled. New soldiers, terrified, ran for the river. For hours, the Confederates drove the Union army back, capturing camps, seizing supplies, seemingly on the verge of destroying Grant's entire force. Johnston, leading from the front, was shot in the leg. The wound seemed minor, but the bullet had severed an artery. He bled to death in minutes. One of the highest-ranking officers killed in the war. P.G.T. Beauregard took command, but the Confederate momentum had slowed. Grant, refusing to panic, organized a defensive line near the river, artillery positioned on a slight rise. Infantry dug in. The position became known as the Hornet's Nest, Union soldiers holding against repeated Confederate assaults. By evening, Union reinforcements arrived. General Don Carlos Buell's army, crossing the river. That night, as rain fell on the battlefield, the wounded cried out. Some drowned in puddles too weak to lift their heads. The living huddled in the mud, exhausted, traumatized. Grant's staff suggested retreat. "Retreat?" Grant said. "No, I propose to attack at daylight and whip them." At dawn on April 7th, the reinforced Union Army counterattacked. The Confederates, exhausted, outnumbered, fell back. By afternoon, they were in full retreat. The Union held the field, but the cost was staggering. Over 23,000 casualties in 2 days, more than all previous American wars combined. Men fought in fields, in forests, in peach orchards where blossoms fell like snow on the dead and dying. The carnage was unimaginable. Bodies piled in heaps, the wounded screaming, blood turning creeks red. One soldier wrote, "I see it all again and again. The scenes haunt me. I cannot sleep." Shiloh destroyed any remaining hope that the war would end soon. It showed both sides that this conflict would consume everything, every resource, every man, every dream of a quick peace. The newspapers called for Grant's removal. Politicians demanded his court-martial. How could he allow such a surprise attack? Such terrible casualties? But Lincoln refused. "I can't spare this man," he said again. "He fights." The war had become a nightmare, and no one knew how to wake up. While armies clashed on land, a revolution in naval warfare was unfolding. Iron met iron at Hampton Roads. For thousands of years, warships had been made of wood. But on March 8, 1862, the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia, formerly the USS Merrimack, emerged from Norfolk. The Virginia was a radical design. A conventional ship's hull cut down, covered with 4 inches of iron plating. Union wooden warships in Hampton Roads, confident in their superiority, moved to intercept. The Virginia destroyed them with contemptuous ease. Cannon balls bounced off her iron sides. Shells that would shatter wooden ships had no effect. The Virginia ran the USS Cumberland, sinking her. Turned her guns on the USS Congress, setting her ablaze. Panic spread through the Union fleet. Through Washington, Lincoln's cabinet met in emergency session. Some feared the Virginia would steam up the Potomac and bombard the capital. But that night, a strange vessel arrived. The USS Monitor, a Union ironclad with a revolutionary design, a flat deck barely above the waterline. A rotating turret mounting 2 11-inch guns. One observer said she looked like a cheese box on a raft. On March 9th, the 2 ironclads met. They circled each other for hours, firing at point-blank range, shells bouncing off armor, neither able to penetrate the other's defenses. The Monitor's turret kept jamming. The Virginia's engines kept overheating. Both ships were experimental, barely functional. Finally, both withdrew. The battle was a draw. But the implications were revolutionary. Wooden ships were instantly obsolete. Every navy in the world suddenly outdated. Nations scrambled to build ironclads. The age of sail was over. The age of industrial warfare had arrived. The battle itself was inconclusive, but its impact was global. The future of naval combat had arrived, and it was made of iron. On land, the Union was finally preparing a major offensive. The Peninsula Campaign brought the Union close to Richmond. General George McClellan, after months of delay, finally moved his army in the spring of 1862. His plan was brilliant. Instead of marching overland to Richmond, where Confederate armies could block him, he would transport his army by water to the Virginia Peninsula, then advance up the peninsula to Richmond from the east. It was the largest amphibious operation in American history to that point. Over 100,000 men, thousands of horses, hundreds of artillery pieces, all transported by ship. McClellan believed he was outnumbered. He always believed he was outnumbered. His intelligence estimates, provided by Detective Alan Pinkerton, wildly exaggerated Confederate strength. In reality, McClellan significantly outnumbered the Confederates defending Richmond. But he advanced slowly, cautiously, siege warfare rather than maneuver. When he encountered Confederate defenses at Yorktown, defended by only 15,000 men, he spent a month preparing for a siege. By the time he was ready to attack, the Confederates had evacuated. McClellan continued his slow advance. By late May, his army was within 6 miles of Richmond. The Union was closer to the Confederate capital than they would be again until 1864. Victory seemed within grasp. Then Robert E. Lee took command. Lee's brilliance was unmatched in the war's early years. When General Joseph Johnston was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines, Confederate President Jefferson Davis appointed Robert E. Lee to command. Lee was 55 years old, a career Army officer, the son of Revolutionary War hero Light Horse Harry Lee. Lincoln had offered him command of Union armies in 1861, but Lee, though personally opposed to secession, could not fight against Virginia. "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children," he had said. Now, Lee faced McClellan's vast army threatening Richmond. His response was characteristically aggressive. Rather than defend, he attacked. In the 7 days' battles, Lee launched a series of assaults against McClellan's army. The attacks were costly. Lee suffered higher casualties than McClellan, but they achieved their purpose. McClellan, already convinced he was outnumbered, panicked. He retreated to the James River, calling desperately for reinforcements. Richmond was saved. Lee had driven back an army twice his size through pure audacity. Over the next year, Lee would win a series of stunning victories. At Second Manassas, he defeated another Union army threatening Richmond. At Fredericksburg, he shattered a massive Union assault, watching from a hilltop as wave after wave of Union soldiers were cut down. "It is well that war is so terrible," he said, "or we should grow too fond of it." At Chancellorsville, with only 60,000 men, he defeated Joseph Hooker's army of over 130,000. Lee divided his force, sent Stonewall Jackson on a flanking march, and crushed the Union right. It was his most brilliant victory, but it came at a terrible cost. Stonewall Jackson, riding back from reconnaissance after dark, was shot by his own men, who mistook his party for Union cavalry. His left arm was amputated. He seemed to be recovering. Then he contracted pneumonia. On May 10, 1863, Jackson died. Lee wept. "I have lost my right arm," he said. Jackson's death, and the heavy casualties from Lee's aggressive tactics, were weakening the Confederacy. Every victory cost men the South could not replace. But in the summer of 1862, Lee seemed invincible. The South believed he could win the war. Europe watched, considering whether to recognize Confederate independence. And Lincoln, frustrated by repeated defeats, searching desperately for a victory, prepared to make a momentous decision. The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war's purpose. Lincoln had always hated slavery, but he was not an abolitionist. Not in 1861. He believed the Constitution protected slavery where it existed. He believed his duty was to preserve the Union, not to free slaves. He feared that emancipation would drive the border states into the Confederacy, that it would divide the North, where many supported the Union but not abolition. But by 1862, his thinking had evolved. Slavery was the foundation of the Confederate economy. Enslaved people grew food, built fortifications, worked in factories. Freeing them would cripple the South's ability to fight. Emancipation would prevent European intervention. Britain had abolished slavery decades earlier. She would not support a slave-holding Confederacy if the Union was fighting to end slavery. And morally, Lincoln was coming to believe it was necessary, that the war provided an opportunity to end America's greatest evil. But he needed a victory. He could not issue the proclamation after a defeat. It would look like desperation. Then, in September 1862, Lee invaded Maryland. At Antietam Creek, McClellan's army met Lee's. It was the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 casualties. The fighting was savage, brutal. At a sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane, bodies piled so thick you could walk across them without touching ground. McClellan, though he had discovered Lee's battle plans, still fought cautiously. But he stopped Lee's invasion. The Confederates retreated to Virginia. It was not a decisive victory, but it was enough. On September 22nd, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that on January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be forever free. The proclamation was limited. It did not free enslaved people in border states or in areas already under Union control. But it transformed the war. The Union was now fighting not just to preserve itself, but to destroy slavery. It gave the war a moral dimension that made European intervention impossible, and it invited enslaved people to flee to Union lines. Thousands did, tens of thousands, eventually nearly 200,000 would serve in the Union military. The proclamation changed everything. The war was no longer about states' rights or constitutional interpretation. It was about freedom. And there would be no going back. The South, recognizing the threat, fought with increased desperation. The North, now fighting for a cause beyond mere Union, found new resolve. The war entered its bloodiest phase. And in the summer of 1863, two battles would determine the Confederacy's fate. Gettysburg changed the direction of history. In June 1863, Robert E. Lee invaded the North for the second time. He had multiple objectives. Draw Union forces out of Virginia, allowing the Confederacy to harvest crops. Threaten northern cities, spread fear, undermine northern morale. Win a decisive victory on northern soil that might force Lincoln to negotiate peace. Perhaps even capture a major city. His army, 75,000 men, marched through Maryland into Pennsylvania. Panic spread through the North. Militia units mobilized. Cities prepared defenses. The Army of the Potomac, now under General George Meade, pursued. The two armies collided at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a small town Lee had not intended to fight at. For 3 days, July 1st through 3rd, they fought the largest battle ever on the North American continent. The first day, Confederate forces pushed Union troops through the town. The Union established defensive positions on high ground south of Gettysburg, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge. The second day, Lee attacked both Union flanks, vicious fighting at places that would become legendary: Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard. Union forces held barely. On the third day, Lee, believing the Union flanks were too strong, decided to attack the center. 15,000 Confederate soldiers, under General George Pickett, formed up in the woods. At 1 p.m., Confederate artillery opened a massive bombardment, over 150 guns, the largest artillery barrage in the Western Hemisphere to that point. For 2 hours, shells pounded the Union lines. Then, in the hot July afternoon, the Confederate infantry advanced across 3/4 of a mile of open ground. In perfect formation, Flags flying, officers on horseback. Union artillery opened fire. Shells tearing holes in the Confederate ranks, men falling by the dozens, by the hundreds. The Confederate lines closed ranks and continued. As they came within rifle range, Union infantry rose and fired. Volley after volley, a wall of lead. The Confederates charged. A brave few, reached the Union lines. For a moment, Confederate flags flew at the stone wall. Then Union reinforcements counterattacked. The Confederate assault broke, survivors streaming back across the field. Lee watched his men return, knowing he had made a terrible mistake. "It is all my fault," he told them. "All my fault." Over 50% casualties. 7,500 men killed, wounded, or captured in less than an hour. The Confederacy never recovered from Gettysburg. It was the high-water mark of Southern independence, the moment when everything changed. Lee would retreat to Virginia. The South would never again invade the North. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. On that same day, half a continent away, another Confederate disaster was unfolding. Vicksburg fell, and the Confederacy was cut in two. While Lee fought at Gettysburg, Ulysses S. Grant was concluding one of the war's most brilliant campaigns. Vicksburg, Mississippi, sat on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, heavily fortified. Defended by 30,000 Confederate troops under General John Pemberton, Vicksburg controlled river traffic. Grant had been trying to capture it for months. Direct assaults failed. The defenses were too strong. So Grant tried something audacious. He marched his army down the west side of the Mississippi, had the Navy run gunboats past Vicksburg's artillery under cover of darkness, then crossed the river below the city, cut loose from his supply lines, and marched inland. His staff protested, his superiors worried, but Grant moved fast. He defeated Confederate forces in a series of battles, captured Jackson, the state capital, then turned west and drove Pemberton's army into Vicksburg's fortifications. Grant laid siege. For 47 days, Vicksburg was surrounded. Confederate soldiers and civilians ate horses, mules, rats, anything they could find. Shells rained down constantly. People lived in caves dug into hillsides. Finally, on July 4, 1863, the day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, Pemberton surrendered. 30,000 Confederate soldiers. Grant had proven himself the North's best general, and the Union now controlled the Mississippi River from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were isolated from the rest of the Confederacy. Lincoln said, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." The dual victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the turning point of the war. From this moment forward, the Confederacy was losing. The only question was how long it would take, and how many more would die before the end. In the West, the Union pressed its advantage. In the East, the armies settled into bloody stalemate, and Lincoln, finally confident in Grant, brought him east to end the war. But first, another Union general would unleash a new kind of warfare. Sherman unleashed total war across Georgia. In May 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman launched his campaign to capture Atlanta. Sherman commanded 3 armies, over 100,000 men. Opposing him, General Joseph Johnston, with 60,000 Confederates. For 4 months, Johnston fought a masterful defensive campaign, retreating slowly, always staying between Sherman and Atlanta, forcing Sherman to maneuver rather than attack. But Jefferson Davis, frustrated by Johnston's retreats, replaced him with General John Bell Hood. Hood was aggressive, he attacked, and lost. At Peachtree Creek, At the Battle of Atlanta, at Ezra Church, Hood's attacks failed with heavy casualties. On September 2nd, Hood evacuated Atlanta. Sherman's army marched in. Lincoln, facing re-election in November, had his victory. The fall of Atlanta ensured Lincoln's re-election, ended any hope of a negotiated peace. But Sherman was not finished. In November, he abandoned his supply lines and marched his army across Georgia to the sea. His objective was not just military, but psychological. He would destroy the South's ability to wage war and break its will to fight. Sherman's men destroyed railroads, heating the rails and bending them around trees, creating twisted metal sculptures called Sherman's neckties. They burned factories, warehouses, cotton gins. They confiscated food, livestock, supplies. They freed enslaved people who followed the army by the thousands. The march was ruthless, calculated to bring the war home to Southern civilians. Sherman believed that destroying the South's economic infrastructure would end the war faster than battles alone, that making civilians feel the war would undermine support for the Confederacy. "War is cruelty," he said. "There is no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over." His 60,000-man army cut a swath of destruction 60 miles wide across 300 miles. On December 21st, Sherman captured Savannah. He sent a telegram to Lincoln. "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." Then he turned north, into South Carolina, the state that had started the war. The destruction there was even worse. Sherman's march broke the South's spirit. Civilians who had supported the war, who had sent sons and husbands to fight, now saw firsthand what war meant. Desertion from Confederate armies increased. The South's economy collapsed. Total war had arrived, and it would leave scars that lasted generations. While Sherman marched, Grant was locked in brutal combat with Lee in Virginia. Grant and Lee clashed in a brutal war of attrition. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general, gave him command of all Union armies. Grant came east to end the war. He understood that the Confederacy's greatest strength was Lee's army of Northern Virginia. Destroy that army, and the war was over. In May, Grant launched the Overland Campaign. He would attack Lee and keep attacking, never letting up, never giving Lee time to recover. The Battle of the Wilderness, May 5th through 7th. In dense forest, where artillery was useless and soldiers could barely see, the armies clashed in brutal close-quarters combat. The underbrush caught fire. Wounded men burned to death. Grant suffered 18,000 casualties. Lee 11,000. Previous Union generals would have retreated after such losses. Grant moved forward. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he said. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, the armies fought for 2 weeks. At a place called the Bloody Angle, men fought hand-to-hand for 20 hours. Bodies piled 4 deep. A tree 22 inches thick was cut down by bullets. More brutal fighting, more casualties. Grant kept moving forward. At Cold Harbor in early June, Grant ordered a frontal assault on Lee's entrenched position. It was a disaster. 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour. Grant later regretted the order, called it his greatest mistake. But he kept moving. He was willing to trade casualties, to grind down Lee's army through sheer persistence. He knew the North could replace its losses. The South could not. Lee fought brilliantly, inflicting heavy losses, using interior lines, entrenching. But he was running out of men, out of supplies, out of time. Grant's relentless determination was breaking the Confederacy's back. In June, Grant crossed the James River and attacked Petersburg, a vital railroad junction south of Richmond. Lee got there first, barely. Grant settled in for a siege. The siege of Petersburg lasted nearly a year, from June 1864 to April 1865. The armies faced each other across miles of trenches. It was a preview of World War I. Trench warfare. Constant shelling, snipers, occasional assaults that gained little ground at high cost. Lee's army was trapped, slowly starving. Union forces outnumbered them 2 to 1, 3 to 1. Supplies dwindled, food became scarce, men deserted in growing numbers, slipping away at night, heading home to starving families. Lee wrote to Jefferson Davis, warning that the army could not hold much longer. But Davis refused to consider surrender. The Confederacy was collapsing. Sherman had captured Atlanta, marched through Georgia, was now marching through the Carolinas. Confederate armies in Tennessee had been destroyed at Nashville. The blockade had strangled Southern trade. The economy was in ruins, Confederate money worthless. And Lee's army, the Confederacy's last hope, was slowly dying. Petersburg was the beginning of the end. A slow, grinding conclusion to 4 years of war. Finally, in late March 1865, Lee attempted a breakout. The attack failed. Grant counterattacked, breaking Lee's lines. On April 2nd, Lee evacuated Petersburg. The Confederate government fled Richmond. Richmond burned as the Confederacy collapsed. When Lee retreated from Petersburg, Confederate officials in Richmond knew the end had come. They loaded government documents, gold reserves, and critical supplies onto trains. Then, they set fire to warehouses and supply depots to prevent them from falling into Union hands. But the fire spread. Fueled by abandoned whiskey barrels, driven by wind, the flames consumed block after block. Explosions rocked the city as arsenals detonated. Buildings collapsed. Panicked civilians fled. Looters broke into stores. Richmond, the Confederate capital, the symbol of Southern independence, was burning. Union troops entered the city on April 3rd. They found the Confederate capital in ruins, fire still raging. The government had fled. The army was in retreat. Abraham Lincoln, incredibly, visited Richmond on April 4th. He walked through the streets. Freed black residents surrounded him. Some knelt. He told them, "Don't kneel to me. You must kneel to God only, and thank Him for your freedom." The Confederacy was finished. But Lee's army, though retreating, was still intact. Grant pursued. Lee hoped to escape, to join with other Confederate forces, to continue the fight. But Union forces blocked his path, surrounded him. On April 8th, Grant sent a message to Lee, asking him to surrender to prevent further bloodshed. Lee replied, asking what terms Grant would offer. They agreed to meet the next day. Appomattox ended the bloodshed with dignity. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant met at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The meeting took place in the home of Wilmer McLean. Ironically, McLean had lived near Manassas in 1861. The first major battle had been fought on his property. He had moved to Appomattox to escape the war. Now the war was ending in his parlor. Lee arrived in full dress uniform, sword at his side. Grant arrived in a muddy private's uniform, wearing no sword. They talked briefly about their service together in Mexico, then discussed terms. Grant was generous. Confederate soldiers would be paroled, allowed to return home. They could keep their horses. Many were farmers who would need them for spring planting. Officers could keep their sidearms. There would be no treason trials, no hangings, no public humiliation. Lee was relieved and grateful. When Lee mentioned that his men had nothing to eat, Grant immediately ordered rations sent to the Confederate army. Lee signed the surrender. As he rode away, Union soldiers began to cheer. Grant ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Lee's surrender effectively ended the war. Other Confederate forces would surrender over the following weeks. But the main Confederate army, the Army of Northern Virginia, had laid down its arms. The bloodshed was over. But the nation's trials were not. Just days after victory, tragedy struck the Union. On the evening of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. The play was Our American Cousin, a comedy. Lincoln, exhausted from 4 years of war, relaxed in the presidential box with his wife. John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor, a Confederate sympathizer, entered the box. He shot Lincoln in the back of the head, then jumped to the stage, breaking his leg in the fall. He shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, and fled. Lincoln was carried to a boarding house across the street. Doctors examined him. The wound was fatal. Lincoln never regained consciousness. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, Abraham Lincoln died. He had guided the nation through its darkest hour, preserved the Union, ended slavery. And now, at the moment of victory, he was gone. The nation plunged into grief. Millions lined the route of his funeral train as it carried his body from Washington to Illinois. Vice President Andrew Johnson became president, and Reconstruction began under a cloud of uncertainty and division. Lincoln had favored a lenient approach to the South. "With malice toward none, with charity for all," he had said in his second inaugural address. Johnson, a Southerner, a former slaveholder, initially took a harsh stance, but then became increasingly lenient toward the South and hostile to black rights. The result was chaos. Reconstruction was a second battle, fought in politics, not fields. The government struggled to rebuild the South, protect freedmen's rights, and reintegrate states into the Union. The challenges were enormous. For a million formerly enslaved people, suddenly free, but with no land, no education, no resources. The Southern economy, based on slavery, had collapsed. Infrastructure was destroyed, cities burned, railroads torn up, factories demolished. The political questions were complex. On what terms should Confederate states be readmitted to the Union? What rights should freed people have? Should Confederate leaders be punished? Should land be redistributed to former slaves? Congress, controlled by radical Republicans, wanted to punish the South and guarantee rights for freedmen. They passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. The 14th Amendment, granting citizenship to all born in the United States. The 15th Amendment, prohibiting denial of voting rights based on race. They established the Freedmen's Bureau to help former slaves. They passed civil rights acts. But President Johnson opposed these measures. He vetoed bills, pardoned Confederate leaders, allowed Southern states to pass black codes limiting freedmen's rights. Congress overrode his vetoes, eventually impeached him. He survived removal by one vote. In the South, resistance to Reconstruction was fierce. The Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations emerged. They murdered black political leaders, attacked black voters, burned schools and churches. Violence against freedmen increased. Federal troops occupied the South, but they could not be everywhere. The promise of equality remained unfulfilled. By 1877, Reconstruction ended. Federal troops withdrew from the South. Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, enforcing segregation. Black voters were systematically disenfranchised through poll taxes, literacy tests, violence. The freedoms won in war were lost in peace. Reconstruction was a war of ideas, and in many ways, the South won it. The scars of slavery and war would shape America for generations. The war officially ended, but its wounds shaped America for centuries. Though the Confederacy collapsed militarily, it continued. The political, racial, and economic divisions born from the war continued to influence the United States long after the guns went silent. Jim Crow laws, segregation, racial violence, lynching. These were the legacy of a war that ended slavery, but did not end racism. The South built monuments to Confederate heroes, rewrote history to portray the war as about states' rights rather than slavery, created the myth of the lost cause. Economic disparities between North and South persisted for a century. The war transformed American society. The federal government grew more powerful. Industry expanded dramatically. The nation became more centralized, less a collection of states and more a unified country. But it did not heal. The Civil War's consequences echoed through Reconstruction, through the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, through debates that continue today. The scars remained, passed down through generations, shaping the nation's identity in ways both profound and painful. The war cost over 600,000 military deaths, more Americans than died in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. Countless civilians perished, from disease, from starvation, from violence. Entire communities were destroyed. A generation was lost. But from the ashes, something new emerged. Slavery was abolished. The institution that had corrupted America since its founding was finally destroyed. The Union was preserved. The idea that states could secede when they disagreed with the federal government was rejected. The federal government's power was established over state sovereignty. African Americans gained citizenship, the right to vote, legal equality, even if those rights would not be fully realized for another century. The war proved that democracy could survive its greatest test. That a nation conceived in liberty could endure even when torn apart by its greatest contradiction. America had confronted its original sin, paid an unimaginable price, and survived. Changed forever, scarred forever, but still standing. From Fort Sumter to Appomattox, the war remade a nation. The American Civil War ended with the Union preserved, slavery abolished, and America transformed forever. It remains the deadliest conflict in United States history, claiming more American lives than any other war. Over 620,000 soldiers died. Some estimates place the number even higher, at 750,000. Millions more were wounded, physically, emotionally, spiritually. The economic cost was staggering. The South's economy was destroyed. The North spent billions financing the war effort. But the human cost, that was beyond measure. Families destroyed, fathers who never came home, sons buried in unmarked graves, women who lost husbands, brothers, fathers, children who grew up without parents, communities that lost entire generations of young men. The war tested whether a nation conceived in liberty could endure, whether a democratic republic could survive, when its people fundamentally disagreed about the meaning of freedom. America answered, at the cost of a generation. The guns of Fort Sumter lit the sky on April 12, 1861. A single shot in the darkness. For years later, when they finally fell silent at Appomattox, the nation they had shattered was reborn, forever changed. The America that emerged from the Civil War was not the same nation that had entered it. It was more centralized, more industrial, more powerful. It had abolished slavery, extended citizenship, redefined freedom. But it was also more divided in some ways. more traumatized, carrying wounds that would take generations to heal. The soldiers who survived, the ones who marched home through ruined landscapes, past burned cities and abandoned farms, carried memories they could never escape. They had seen things no human should see. Friends blown apart by artillery. Men with limbs torn off, screaming for help that could not come. Fields covered with bodies. Rivers running red with blood. The smell of death that clung to everything. Many could not speak of what they had witnessed. Some drank to forget. Others simply withdrew, haunted by memories. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was called soldier's heart, or nostalgia. But whatever the name, the suffering was real, and it lasted long after the war ended. The women who had sent men to war, who had waited, hoped, prayed. Many waited for men who would never return. They rebuilt, often alone. They raised children, ran farms, kept communities together. In the South, they faced poverty, occupation, the collapse of everything they had known. In the North, they faced the return of damaged men, the loss of sons and husbands. The realization that victory had come at a terrible price. And the formerly enslaved 4 million people, suddenly free, but in a hostile land. Without education, without resources. Facing violence from those who refused to accept their freedom. Betrayed by a nation that granted them legal freedom, but denied them economic opportunity. Their struggle for true freedom, for equality, for justice, would continue for another century. The Civil War did not end racism. It did not create a just society. It did not heal the nation's divisions. But it did something. It ended slavery, an institution that had existed for 250 years. It preserved the Union, ensuring that the United States would remain one nation. It established that the federal government had authority over the states. It proved that democracy could survive even the most severe test. And it set the nation on a path, however long and difficult, toward a more perfect union. The Civil War is not ancient history. Its consequences are still felt today, in racial inequalities that persist, in regional identities that remain strong, in debates about federal versus state power, in monuments and memorials that dot the landscape, in the stories families tell. The war shaped America, for better and worse. It revealed both the best and worst of the nation, the courage of soldiers who fought for what they believed in, the cruelty of a system built on human bondage, the determination of people who refused to accept injustice, the resilience of a nation that could survive being torn apart. Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, spoke of binding up the nation's wounds. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said. But he was killed before he could guide the healing. And the healing, when it came, was incomplete. The wounds remained, some still unhealed. But the nation survived. Imperfect, struggling, but still striving toward its founding ideals. The Civil War was America's greatest crisis. The test of whether a nation dedicated to liberty could endure, whether a democratic republic could survive fundamental disagreement, whether Americans could find a way forward together. The war answered some questions, and created others that we are still trying to answer. From the first cannon shot at Fort Sumter, to the final surrender at Appomattox, and beyond, into Reconstruction and into our own time. The Civil War shaped, and continues to shape, what America is, and what America might yet become. This was the American Civil War, a conflict born from decades of tension over slavery, states' rights, and the meaning of freedom. Fought with courage, brutality, and determination by soldiers on both sides. Directed by leaders, some brilliant, some flawed, all human. Endured by civilians who suffered, persevered, and rebuilt. Ended with Union victory, but at a cost that still staggers the imagination. The war that began with a single cannon shot grew into the deadliest conflict in American history, transformed a nation, and left scars that have never fully healed, but also, perhaps, pointed the way, however imperfectly, toward a more just, a more equal, a more united America. This is not just history. This is the story of who we were, who we became, and who we might still be. The American Civil War. From Fort Sumter to Appomattox. From slavery to emancipation. From division to unity. However imperfect that unity may be, this is the story of America. In its darkest hour. And its rebirth.